Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to a very special episode of Never Lost. Today, I will not be telling or talking about an old fairy tale. Instead, I will be telling a completely original story which I've written in dedication to my best friend and my constant companion of the past 12 and a half years, my little Sheltie, Beg. In honour of him and his memory, I'd like to tell you my fairy tale of how the first Shetland sheepdog came to be. So, without further ado, let's sit back and start the story. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, there was a god named Artaeus who was worshipped across all the Celtic lands as the master of herds. Most of the evidence that we have for the worship of Artaeus comes from Celtic Gaul, but he was most certainly revered in Scotland as well, where sheep and cattle farming were a way of life for so many people. Artaeus was the greatest shepherd and the keeper of the domestic flocks of the old gods, the Tuatha De Danann. Artaeus herded and watched over the flocks of the gods with the help of his two dogs, who were called Gu Vod, which means strong wind in Gaelic, and Chalanach, which means lightning. It is said that Artaeus gifted puppies, sired by wind and lightning, to the men of Scotland, and that all herding dogs today are distant descendants of those dogs. It is also said that the blood of wind and lightning flows strongest in the border collies, which is why they make by far the best and the most popular herding dogs, even now. This can be seen if you ever watch Scottish sheepdog trials. There may be a few bearded collies, and you might even see a rough collie, but most of the dogs will be border collies, running like lightning round the sheep and turning like the wind as they drive the flock towards the gated pen where the shepherd waits by the open gate. So, border collies were the ubiquitous herding dog across Scotland. This was true on the mainland and even on the islands, including the Shetland Isles, which lie farther north than any other part of Scotland, right between the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the North Sea to the east, roughly 100 miles from the coast of the mainland. Within the Shetland Isles, there's a small island on the south side called Faerie, which has always been famous for its knitwear and for its sheep. In fact, there have always been more sheep on Faerie than people. Faerie is, as I said, a little island, being just under 5 kilometres long and about 2.5 kilometres wide. A long time ago, there was a family who worked a croft on Faerie, the Macphersons. The small holding had been in the Macphersons' hands for generations, and they had always got by fairly well with the few cattle and pigs that they kept, along with the roughly 50 head of sheep. The head of the family, Donald Macpherson, and his wife Alice, had two grown sons, Angus and Douglas, and a daughter, aged 17, called Heather. Donald was a hardy old Scots traditionalist, a manly man from a long line of manly men. He had worked hard all his life, hoping that his oldest son, Angus, would one day marry and take over the croft, and Douglas would marry and find a croft of his own. His daughter, Heather, he hoped would find a good husband and make a good wife. His last hope seemed the least likely of the three, since Heather was quite different to most of the young girls on Fair even any of the girls that Donald had ever met, except maybe her best friend and companion, Mary, a girl from another croft not far away who had no brothers or sisters herself. Heather and Mary had become close friends at a young age, and they were near inseparable as the two girls grew up together. Neither girl had become what most young crofters looked for in a wife. Heather was a strong and hard-working lassie, which was well enough, but she was proud and outspoken for a lass. She was also not in the least bit interested in the activities that befit a young girl, knitting or weaving or housekeeping. Heather far preferred to go out and work the land along with her older brothers. She could wrestle and shear sheep as fast as any man, and faster if truth be told, than either her father or her brothers. Mary was quieter and more traditionally feminine, but inexplicably had absolutely no interest in wedding any of the eligible young men whom she met, preferring the company of her childhood friend to any of the local lads. Donald indulged his daughter for the most part, allowing her to do more manual labour than any other young lass on Fair Isle, and letting her frequently watch the flock on the hills when it was needed. Where Donald drew the line was in herding and driving the sheep. This had traditionally always been the job of men. The family had 3 excellent border collies: Donald's own bitch, Canna, which is the name of another Scottish island, and Angus and Douglas's dogs, named Wind and Lightning, after the dogs of the ancient shepherd god Artaeus. All 3 of the collies were fantastic herding dogs, and to see them working together was an incredible sight. Heather dearly wished for a border collie of her own, and to be allowed to herd the sheep along with her father and brothers, but Donald would have none of it. "A working collie is no dog for a lassie," he would say. "Driving a flock requires a man and dog to work as one, thinking and reacting together. It's no job for a young woman. Let your mother teach you to turn the fleeces into fine knitwear, and leave the herding to your brothers and I. And stop spending your time with that Mary. You'll never find a good young lad if you waste all your spare time with that odd young lassie." Then, looking to his wife, he would ask, "Am I no right, Alice?" And Alice would answer, "Yes, dear, that is indeed the way it has always been." After a while, Heather gave up asking, but she never stopped wishing, and she would watch her father and brothers as they drove the sheep, thinking that if only she could somehow get the chance, she could do as well, if not better, than they did. Which was a proud thought, to be sure, because Donald and his sons were very good shepherds, and their dogs, Canna, Wind and Lightning, were exceptional dogs. Canna especially was an incredible herding dog, and in fact, later that very year, Donald won the annual Fair Isle Sheepdog trials with Canna, which were attended by crofters and shepherds from across all the Shetland Islands. Heather, with Mary by her side, watched as her father competed, and saw Canna bring the flock in faster than any dog had for many years. "I could do it, you know, Mary," she said, as the 2 young women stood with the spectators, "if only there was a way." Mary clasped her friend's hand and said, "Dinna fash, my bonny Heather. Perhaps one day there will be a way. After all, there's no rule that says a woman can't enter the trials. It's just that it simply hasn't been done yet." Donald was right pleased with his win at the trials, which came with a not insubstantial cash prize. Also, now that Canna was a champion, her puppies were worth a pretty penny, and would be much sought after by herders from all across the islands. Donald decided to breed from Canna not long after the trials, and soon Canna was pregnant with a litter of pups, sired by his son's dog, Lightning. Heather asked repeatedly if she could have one of the pups for her own, and train it to be as good as its mother. But Donald repeatedly answered, "No, lass. We've talked about this before, and my mind has not changed. Men have always done the herding. Am I no right, Alice?" And Heather's mother would say, "Yes, dear, that is indeed the way it has always been." When Canna gave birth, it was to 9 helpless little puppies, 4 bitches and 5 dogs. The 4 girls and 4 of the boys developed quickly over the next few weeks into plump little healthy border collie pups. The same, though, couldn't be said for the smallest of the litter. He had been the last to be born, and it is often the way in large litters that there is a runt who is weaker and grows slower than any of the others. This little pup, though, wasn't just growing slower than his brothers and sisters, he was, it seemed, growing different. His tiny head was an odd shape, with a pronounced stop before his snout, and his short nose also came to a sharp point compared to a normal border collie pup. Despite the smallest pup's differences, or maybe because of them, Heather cared for the littlest dog more than the rest of the litter. When he was pushed off a teat by his brothers and sisters, she would sit and hand feed the tiny pup with goat's milk, and then sing to him, while he snuggled into her petticoat as she sat by the fire. After 9 weeks, when the pups were ready to leave their mother and be sold to other crofters, the littlest dog's differences were even more conspicuous. The tiny pup was, by this time, about half the size of his brothers and sisters, and while the other pups were growing out of their puppy fluff, he seemed to be getting more floofy by the day. When Donald came to take the litter to Shetland's main island for sale, he decided not to even take the oddly shaped, underdeveloped little dog, as no herdsman who knew anything about dogs would buy him anyway. Heather begged her father to let her keep the little pup, but the old man looked at her somberly and said, "Nay, Heather, I told ye, women don't have herding dogs. Besides, that little runt will never be a working dog anyway, and a farm can't afford to feed a dog that doesna work. Ye ken well what must be done, and I expect it done before I get back from Shetland. Am I no right, Alice?" And his wife replied, "Yes, dear, that is indeed the way it has always been." And with that, Donald took the 8 border collie pups to Shetland to be sold. Heather knew her father wasn't heartless, just coldly pragmatic, as he had been taught to be by his father and his father before him. Crofting was a hard life, with little to spare and few times of plenty. Their family had been successful over generations by being coldly pragmatic. Nonetheless, when she went with Mary to the bothy on the hill that she kept watch on the sheep from, she found she simply didn't have the heart to do as her father had said. She had dug a small hole outside the bothy and even made a little grave marker for the pup, but she couldn't go through with it. Instead, she sat inside the bothy with Mary beside her, stroking her hair, and wept for the poor little pup as she cradled him in her arms. Heather's sorrow did not go unnoticed. In fact, she was being watched by a pair of tiny eyes from the rafters of the small bothy. The unseen watcher was a travelling brownie who had stopped at the bothy the night before. Brownies are Scottish house fairies who live on farms, crofts, mills, anywhere really that they can be of use. They normally only come out at night when they perform helpful tasks for the property where they stay. After watching Heather with the pup for some time, this brownie clambered down and approached the sad young woman. Heather was startled when the little brownie appeared. She had heard of brownies, but she had never seen one before. Also, all the stories of the little house fairies that she had heard had been about male brownies, but this one was quite obviously female. The brownie woman stood about a foot tall and was far from a pretty little thing. Her skin was a dark hazelnut colour and incredibly wrinkled, and her hair, which reached near to the ground, was thick and blonde, but matted with sticks and grime. However, when the brownie spoke, her voice was rich and kind. "Tell me, child, why do you weep so over this little pup? Is it sick? If so, perhaps I can be of help. I have some knowledge of healing." Wiping her eyes, Heather explained that the pup wasn't sick, just different, but that her father had ordered it disposed of, as the farm could ill afford to keep a dog who would likely never work. But she simply couldn't kill the cute little floofy thing, as she had grown to love it dearly. "Ah, that is a sad, sad thing," said the brownie woman. "Nae creature should be cast aside in such a manner. Place it on the ground, lass, and let old Gwendolen, which is my true name, have a look at it." Heather put the pup down, and the brownie woman lifted his head and looked long into his tiny eyes. "There is naught wrong with this bonny wee beast, lass, though he is different, to be sure. I've no seen his like before in my many years on this isle. It's my thinking that we both sit and tell each other our stories, for mayhap we can be of great mutual help, while also helping this little one." Heather told Gwendolen her life's story, while the brownie sat cross-legged on the bothy floor, constantly smoking a pipe which she had pulled from one of the many pockets of her Hessian dress. When Heather mentioned her wish that she have a dog of her own that she could train and work, the little woman tisked softly and said, "Wishing is aye dangerous, lass. Ye maun get what ye wish for, but ye can never ken what ye'll get. Though I see nae harm in your want. In fact, sure I am now that we can help one another, and that your helping is the reason I'm here." Now Gwendolen told Heather and Mary how she had been the croft brownie for a farm across the island until recently. She would help the croft wife with the weaving and the knitting of the wool. Some weeks ago, the farm had passed to the eldest son and his wife when the old crofter became too old to work the farm alone. The new owners had come back from the mainland and had no knowledge of brownies. All the little folk wanted was to be of use, and for porridge to be left out for them, and maybe occasionally a good dram of whisky. Sadly, the new crofter had gifted Gwendolen a bonny red and white bonnet, which their child had grown out of. Although this was an act of kindness, it was still sad for the brownie woman, because giving a brownie clothing of any kind forces the creature to leave the house it serves. Gwendolen explained that this was due to a faerie curse put on all brownies long, long ago by the queen of the Downie Stories, who were the tall, elven faerie nobility. So, Gwendolen had to move on and look for a new purpose somewhere else. However, now the little lady believed she had found that purpose. She would stay at the bothy permanently and become a bothy brownie. What's more, she would happily care for Heather's special little pup whenever Heather could not, and he could be hidden safely in the bothy along with her for as long as was needed. Heather was overjoyed and immediately accepted the brownie's kind offer. She hugged the small puppy to her breast and named him Beg, which means little in Gaelic. When they left, Heather and Mary promised to bring food for little Beg each day, as well as for Gwendolen, and Heather swore she would spend as much time at the bothy as she could. The arrangement worked even better than expected. Almost every day Heather told her father Donald that she was off to watch the flock on the hill from the bothy. When she came, she would find Gwendolen at the bothy with a fire burning in the hearth, but through some magic not giving off any smoke. Beg was usually curled up beside the fireplace at Gwen's feet, but whenever he saw Heather, he would jump up and wag his entire back end in happiness. Heather watched Beg grow into a healthy and happy little dog, although nothing like any border collie that she had ever seen. He was no larger than a terrier, and his coat was thick and fluffy, with a great mane of hair about his head. He held his poofy tail up, and it curled over his rump. His cute snout came to a point, and his small beady eyes were slightly almond-shaped. His predominantly black hair and white legs, stomach, and chest were accented with brown around the eyes and on his nose and cheeks. As soon as he was old enough, Heather began to teach Beg to herd. She brought chickens and ducks up from the croft, and she delighted in watching Beg as he rounded the birds together and drove them around the bothy in clucking and quacking little flocks. Beg even herded Mary and Heather when they took him across the hills, crossing back and forth behind the two young women as they walked, and trying to bring them back together if they strayed too far apart. Donald never suspected what his daughter was doing while she went to watch the sheep each day. One reason for this was that Gwendolen spent much of her time knitting, and Heather would take finished garments back with her, telling her father that she had made them. Soon, Heather started Beg working sheep up at the bothy. Mary would watch with Gwendolen, sharing a whisky with the brownie, while Heather and Beg moved sheep about the hillside. Beg may have been small, but he had the spirit of a dog much larger. He pelted around the flock, barking almost constantly, and if the sheep refused to move, he would nip at the heels of the stubborn animals. Gwendolen remarked one day as Beg barked the flock past the door of the bothy, If that little dog doesn't have lightning in his blood, he most certainly has thunder in his heart. They make quite a team, right enough." Mary looked on admiringly and said, "Aye, they're both amazing. But is Beg fast enough, do you think? I reckon Heather has a mind to enter the sheepdog trials." The brownie woman looked thoughtful for a moment, then replied, "Beg will never be as fast as a border collie, but there's more than one way to knit a jumper. The faerie technique is no the fastest, but I've always thought it the best." Mary was right about her friend. Now that Beg was 2 years old and more than comfortable and competent with her father's sheep, Heather was indeed going to enter the annual faerie sheepdog trials. All that spring she practiced with Beg every day until they were both as good as they could be. She didn't tell Donald, her father, that she had entered, partly because she wasn't sure that she would go through with it, and partly because she was doing it to prove a point to her father. When the trial day came, though, Heather was sure that Beg was good enough. He could control her father's sheep as well as any border collie, and after all, herding well was about more than just speed. Nevertheless, she was slightly dismayed when, with Mary beside her, she watched her father's dog Canna put in another championship performance and bring the sheep to the pen in record time. As new competitors, Heather and Beg were the last pair to run in the trials. When her name was called, she took some small satisfaction from the look of stunned surprise on her father's face when he heard her name, although that was nothing next to his shock at seeing his daughter walk out to the pen in the field, crook in hand, with a terrier-sized little ball of hair and fluff trotting along happily beside her. When the judge waved her to begin, Heather gave a shrill whistle, and Beg was off as fast as his little legs could shift him, going away from her and round the rear of the flock of 3 sheep. The sheep looked at the little dog with what seemed a mixture of disdain and confusion. Heather's father's sheep had become relatively compliant and respectful of Beg once they became familiar with the feisty little dog. For these sheep, though, a tiny version of what usually herded them was a new experience. They soon moved, though, when the constantly barking Beg gave a few threatening nips at their feet. But they kept trying to scatter, and Beg had to work incredibly hard to keep the small flock together and moving in the right direction. Racing back and forth in wide half circles behind the sheep, Beg drove them where Heather told him to. Up the field and the right way round the winding pegs, then back down towards the final casting peg and the open gate of the pen. When the 3 sheep trotted into the pen, Heather quickly shut and latched the gate, then turned and caught Beck as he leapt up into her arms. It had been far harder than she had imagined, but her little Beg had performed flawlessly. Just not nearly as fast as a border collie could have. As she held Beg in her arms, she heard the loud applause and cheers of Mary and her mother from the sidelines, and the less enthusiastic but begrudgingly impressed clapping from many of the other shepherds. Donald, though, was not clapping, nor did he look impressed. Despite the fact that Heather and Beg had placed 6th out of all the dogs competing, and the fact that his dog Canna had again come first, her father had a look of dark anger on his face. He was still red-faced and seething when he went up to receive his first-place rosette, and he left quickly after shaking the judge's hands. Although many of the other shepherds, including her brothers, had complimented Heather after the trials, Donald was ready to scold his daughter when she returned home later that day. Sitting in his chair by the fire, he stood up as soon as Heather entered with Beg at her heel. "How could you, girl?" he shouted angrily. "What you did today was doubly shameful. Women do not enter the sheepdog trials, and to enter and compete with a minute little runt of a dog who had no chance of ever winning is nearly as bad. You've embarrassed the whole family." Heather was stood in the doorway, during Donald's outburst. Now she turned and without a word walked out. Beck, who had been barking the entire time, followed at her heel. Donald turned to his wife and said, "Am I no right, Alice?" Heather's mother looked at her husband and said, "That is indeed the way it has always been, dear. But no, you're no right. You're a stubborn old man, and the only embarrassment is your own foolish pride." After walking away from her father, Heather went straight to the bothy, along with Beg. When she arrived, Mary was already there, sitting and sharing a dram with the little brownie woman. Heather threw herself down on a pile of rugs and sacking by the smokeless fire and let out a great sigh. Gwendolen puffed on her small pipe and asked, "Why so glum, child? From what Mary tells me, it went as well as could be expected today. 6th place out of more than 40 dogs is very good for a first time. Indeed, you may well have earned the respect of some of the shepherds on the island." As Beg snuzzled his nose into Heather's hand, she looked up at the brownie and said, "Some maybe, but certainly not all, and certainly not my father. He called Beg a runt, with no chance of ever winning." Mary put her hand on Heather's arm and gently said, "I'm sure that he didn't mean it. He's just an old-fashioned sort of man, and you did kind of spring the whole thing on the poor fellow." Heather was unconvinced. "No, he meant it, and maybe he's right. Not about the runt part," she said, addressing Beg, "but I don't think we will ever be as fast as Canna or the best of the border collies." Gwendolen took the pipe from her lips and explained, "Pish and tosh, lassie. It sounds as if you're giving up after trying once. Trying once and not failing, I might add. I recall a tale told to me by Hairy Ned, the cave brownie. He had a king take shelter in his cave once long ago. The great Bruce himself it was, after his defeat at the Battle of Methven. The Bruce was thinking on giving up, but he watched a spider in the cave, repeatedly trying and failing to spin a web. Eventually, after many attempts, the spider succeeded, and from that the Bruce learned perseverance. Now ye must learn the same lesson. Nobody ever achieved anything by giving up, and if you can't beat the best collies at their own game, then you can change the rules. But you can never give up. Does little Beg look as if he's ready to give up?" As if in answer, Beg gave a loud bark. So Heather didn't give up. All the rest of the summer, she kept practicing with Beg, despite her father's disapproval. And they got better. They may never be as fast as the best collie, but they could work to be more accurate and constantly improve, which they did. All summer and autumn, while Heather worked along with Beg, she thought about the wise little brownie's words. Never give up. There's more than one way to knit a jumper. Change the rules. But though she pondered long, she couldn't think of a way that she could change the rules. Then, on a fateful winter's night, something happened that changed the rules for her. During the depths of winter that year, the Shetland Islands were struck by a terrible and fierce storm. Rain fell in great torrents from the skies, and gale-force winds scoured the hills and drove the rain almost horizontally across the land. The temperature dropped to well below freezing, and the rain turned to hail and sleet. Huge forked bolts of lightning cut the sky, and for a split second lit the hills and glens with a blinding light and a great crash of thunder. This was some of the most dangerous weather for flocks of sheep to be out on the hills. Anybody who works with sheep regularly will tell you that among their many virtues, intelligence is not high on the list. Sheep are hardy and stubborn beasts, strong and single-minded, but your average sheep also possesses the approximate intellectual capacity of a boiled potato, and about the same survival instinct as a suicidal lemming. In storms like the one which now lashed Faerie, sheep fled in fear from the lightning, and often ran over cliffs or into ravines. They also took shelter from the rain in the least safe place they could possibly find, such as overhanging banks of small burns, which would very soon become raging rivers, which could wash the frightened creatures away. The storm hit Faerie so suddenly that none of the farms on the island had time to bring their flocks in before the full force of the tempest was raging. As night began to fall and the wind roared and the lightning broke the sky, Donald turned to his sons and said, "Come on, Angus, Douglas, grab the collies. We have to get the sheep in before they scatter and we lose half the flock to this storm." The three men quickly got into their coats and pulled their hoods over their heads. Then, along with the three collies, Canna, Wind, and Lightning, they went out into the dark storm. However, less than 10 minutes later, the men staggered back into the croft, soaking wet and wind-battered. The collies looked even worse, shivering and dripping water onto the floor. "It's no use," gasped Donald. "The dogs are already soaked to the skin and freezing. They were near blown away by those winds. The sheep have likely scattered already. We'll never find them in that storm before the dogs freeze to death. We'll have to wait out the worst of the storm and hope the sheep find safe shelter." Heather leapt to her feet and shouted, "Dad, you can't! That's the worst storm I've ever seen. We'll lose them." Donald looked grave. "We'll lose the collies if we go back out there, lass." Heather looked out of the rattling window at the raging storm, just as another crash of thunder seemed to shake the walls. Then she looked up and suddenly bolted for the door, grabbing her thick jacket as she passed the coat rack. By the time Donald had shouted, "Heather, no!" she was already through the door and had disappeared into the rain and hail-filled darkness outside. Heather ran straight to the bothy and flung open the door. "Beg, come!" she cried. Beg leapt to his feet and was at Heather's heel in a moment. But before she could turn and leave, one word from Gwendolen, "Stop!" seemed to freeze her feet to the ground beneath her. "Where do you think you're off to in this weather, child?" the brownie asked calmly. "There's no time, Gwen," said Heather impatiently. "Sheep all over the Fair Isle will have fled and be in trouble. We have to help them. We have to bring them in." Gwendolen puffed on her little pipe and said, "Sheep all over Fair Isle. So it's not just your father's flock you're looking to save. A noble act, to be sure. But why should it be down to you to save them?" Heather looked intently at the brownie woman. "Because father's collies can't go out in that storm, which means nobody's collies can go out. But the cold won't reach Beg through his layers of floof, and the rain won't get past his thick hair. He may be light, but he's low to the ground and shan't be blown away by any gale." The brownie woman nodded and smiled an almost smug smile as she said, "So, the rules have changed. Fair enough. Give me but a moment to grab a light which will not be blown out by that storm, and we shall all three of us go." Heather's frustration turned to gratitude in an instant, and soon, with the way ahead of them lit by a hooded lantern, she and Gwendolen were following Beg across the hills in search of the scattered flocks. Beg raced ahead, scenting the sheep out. When he found some, he barked continually until Heather and Gwen caught up. Somehow the little dog could always be heard above the noise of the storm. Heather and Gwendolen spent the whole night rescuing the sheep that Beg led them to. They pulled sheep from rising rivers and up from halfway down cliffs. They untangled sheep from thorn and gorse bushes, and they even had to get a sheep out of one of Fair Isle's very few trees, although they had no idea how the sheep got up there. Each sheep they rescued was found by Beg, and then he wouldn't leave the animal until it was freed. He barked non-stop, which actually seemed to calm the frightened sheep. When a large enough number of the sheep were collected, Heather and Beg would herd the huge flocks of up to 200 animals to safety at the nearest farm. Then they would turn around and head back out into the dark storm to find and save more. Heather and Beg worked all through the dark and stormy night until they had checked every inch of Fair Isle and saved every sheep that they possibly could. It would be untrue to say they saved every single sheep. Some had inevitably succumbed to the harsh weather before Beg found them. But thanks to Beg and Heather, no croft on Fair Isle lost more than 1 or 2 sheep, instead of the majority of their flocks. When the storm finally broke, the next afternoon, Heather and Beg collected her father's sheep from the nearby croft where they had left them during the night, and together they drove the flock of 50 sheep back across the hills and home to her parents' croft. The whole family were obviously relieved and overjoyed that Heather was safe. Also, Donald could hardly believe what his daughter and Beg had achieved. Every single one of his sheep were alive and well, and there was more. Heather told them that she had also rescued almost all of the sheep from every croft on the island. Donald recognised that along with Beg, Heather had done what no shepherd with a border collie could have. He hugged his daughter tight to his chest with one arm and scratched Beck behind the ear with the other, and said, "You are both amazing, my girl, and Beg may be no border collie, but he is a true Shetland sheepdog, the likes of which has never been seen before." Many months later, when the lambing season was over, Heather and Beg were at the bothy, sharing a dram with Mary and Gwendolen, when the little brownie said, "The sheepdog trials are coming up soon, are they not? Will you and Beg be trying again this year?" Beg's ears pricked up at the mention of his name. Heather thought for a moment before replying, "There's no need. We've proved what I wanted to prove. Besides, you said it yourself, we really won't ever be as fast as the best of the border collies." Gwendolen puffed on her little pipe and said, "Perhaps, perhaps. But maybe, just maybe the rules have changed, lass. Sheep are not the smartest of creatures, to be sure, but they're not stupid. And there isn't a sheep on the island now that wasn't saved by that incredible little sheepdog. I'd be interested to know how it goes this year, if you decide to enter, that is." "So would I," said Mary. "And you've both been working the sheep on my father's croft as well this year, and far better and faster than he used to." Heather decided that she too was interested to see how it would go, and so when the Fair Isle sheepdog trials were held, she was there with Beg. This time, when her name was called, there was a look of glowing pride on her father's face as she walked into the field with a terrier-sized little ball of hair and fluff trotting along happily beside her. The 3 sheep were let loose into the field, and Beg walked slowly up to them and sat some distance away, giving the flock meaningful side-eyes and making low, unthreatening growls. When the judge waved his hand to begin, Heather gave a loud, shrill whistle, and Beck was off, straight as an arrow, towards the sheep, barking. This time, though, there was no hint of the sheep scattering, and Beg didn't have to run wide half-circles around them. The sheep set off at a run, with Beg barking right behind them, straight up the field and round the winding pegs, then straight back down the field and round the final casting peg. Finally, at a flat run, the sheep shot directly into the pen, and Heather closed and latched the gate behind them, then turned and caught Beck as he leapt up into her arms. There was a moment of stunned silence from the crowd, which was broken by the clapping and cheering of Donald and his family and Mary. The applause was immediately picked up by every spectator around the field, who had never seen anything like what they had just witnessed. Even the fastest of the best border collies couldn't make sheep do that. It almost wasn't herding. It was like sheep sprinting. It was as though Beg had just raced along behind the flock and told the sheep exactly where to go. When Heather shook the almost baffled judge's hand and received her rosette for first place, she held Beg up for all to see. Not the fastest or the best border collie, but the first ever Shetland sheepdog. In the years that followed, Donald saw his eldest son marry and inherit the croft, and his younger son marry and find a croft of his own. His daughter, Heather, never married. She and Gwendolen moved in with Mary when her friend inherited her parents' croft, and along with Beg, Heather worked the farm better than any man could have. Heather also started a breeding line of the first ever Shetland Sheepdogs. They were never as fast as the best border collies, but they cost less to keep and they were able to work in weather that a collie just couldn't. Donald couldn't wish for anything more for his daughter, and neither could Heather. With Beg, she had done more than she ever believed possible. She had trained and worked the first ever Shetland Sheepdog, a legacy which can still be seen to this day. And there is a little bit of Beg in every Sheltie that you meet. That is the end of the story of the first ever Shetland Sheepdog. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a comment or hit that like button. And I very much hope to see you next story.